Let's look at the Hittites, R1b haplogroups, chariots, iron, and the first Indo-European writing system. It'll make some connections to other videos that we did just recently. I just recently did one where I showed a three-parter on a Luwian studyist who has done a lot of work in the ancient Hittites and showed their astrotheology built into their whole place, whenever actually just recently people had reiterated that there wasn't any, but there was. Each one of these things means a whole lot. R1b means a whole lot. But R1b, R1a, R itself derives from N, and N goes back to Cro-Magnons, which we find at least 30,000 years having this haplotype. But their type goes back to at least 50,000 years, and that's just earliest that we found. Somebody could find 160 or 70 all of a sudden and go, boom, here you go. But regardless of that fact, R1b is derived from that. It's seen in certain people. We've talked recently about how King Tut's dynasty and the part comes from this people. So when we're talking about this today, this is not the first wave, as I said before, of these people who had gone around. And if you wanted to kick in the very start of the first Conan movie right now and what he says in the intro, that'd probably fit quite well. I'd probably get monetized for it or something. So here we're seeing these people that have this extent in certain places that's come out, and in a modern day where you see it a lot too. Still, yet these are the ancient cultures of the Yamnaya culture, the Kurgan culture. Yamnaya is up there in the top right, that's purple. Kurgan culture is just below that in pink at the top of the Black Sea. They talk about how these people, even in the King Tut interview that I did with one of the main people that runs it, or ran the IGEA studies on it, and they said, yeah, well, it has Tsar Nicholas of Russia is kin to it, but also they don't know how it got there, and the strangeness that it seemed to show, which a lot of us didn't seem to think it was so strange. In fact, it was a complete verifier, but that they were found around the Black Sea area and up through the Caucasus area, and that's kind of the area in the map that we're looking at. The golden area you see in the topish area there is the globular amphora culture that ran through. And so all of these different ones are different types of Proto-Indo-Europeans, and there's also slight variations in haplogroups. It's not just R1b, but R1a and others, and then female mitochondrial haplogroups. I'm just now getting into this to be able to verify a lot of things that we were saying before. So now we can go over the same thing instead of trying to show pottery and try to make connections and, well, they had trade at least, and I don't know. It'd be like, yeah, well, this is who this was and this is who that was. Oh, so they were already the same people? Yeah, let's continue. So what we're looking at here is Anatolia, and it shows you the R1b extent of Baden E0 culture, which was here. And we know of this as being like the Mycenaean and Greeks of the ancient world, right? Or here's the boot of Italy. And that's connections down through here, but it goes further down through here because they're found in Egypt and all kinds of places. I recently did a video, well, it's been a year ago now or so, where they described it some 65 to 6,900 years, blue-eyed people all came down through the Holy Land and so on, and it made connections, and I did ones through there. In fact, they'll show an artifact here that, if you remember, had the scepter that had the ram's horns on it, and of course the time of Aries and so on that we talked about before. And again, you can cue that starting of the Conan the Barbarian movie. In fact, we're going to talk about Sumerians and Sumerians. But let's just get into this and where these people came and connected to for at least a second time. Eupedia, the north part of the Yamna horizon culture, was forested steppe occupied by R1 people, also joined by a small minority of R1b, judging from modern Russians and Belisarians. The frequency of R1b was from 7 to 9 times less lower than R1a. But there are still connections with Tsar Nicholas of Russia and that ending that heritage that ran through there and then what's going on now. I can't go too deep into that, but let's just leave that alone for now and continue. The western branch would migrate to the Balkans and Greece, then to Central and Western Europe, and back to their ancestral Anatolia in successive waves. We've talked about this in a few other videos and the way it works. Hittites, Phrygians, ancient Armenians, etc. This eastern branch would migrate to Central Asia, Xinjiang province, even Siberia, and South Asia, Iran, Pakistan, and India. Now there's variations and cuts between that too, and we've talked about Tarim Basin mummies and the pyramids that are all over China and what it founded their culture and helped found their culture, look that way, and also about India, so we have that connections there. But also this same thing is found in a variation in ancient Sumeria, all through Anatolia, which is connected from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, but then around the Mediterranean, and even in the ruling class of Egypt here just recently, did a separate video about this. The northern branch, though, would evolve into the corded ware culture and disperse around the Baltic, Poland, Germany, and Scandinavia. So that's where they kind of come from, and then you get the Vikings and all that that comes out of it. But let's stay back in the era where we're trying to talk about, which is really a middle area, and people that had already come to Middle Earth long before, and then we're doing it again. 4. On your left, you see a picture that you would think of as Sumerian iconography, perhaps maybe Assyrian iconography. Except for if you looked close, even though he's running over somebody in a chariot, which would look very similar, under his feet are a swirl pattern that's very much connected to Celtic type people. If you look at the wheel, though, one thing strange, that sure is a small wheel, not a little bitty wheel compared to a comparison of it. But he's got this advanced chariot, but it's the thing it's hooked up to that makes it different. For it's not an oxen or a donkey or anything like that, for it is a horse with a braided mane on it and a pom-pom headdress. And you wonder where the Egyptians, once they eventually pull this off that we talked about, and getting back with that culture that they called brothers during the Amarna period and so on, that had horses and advanced technology that souped up Egypt and helped carry them through the last part of their dynasties. Now on your right is also a Hittite weapon, much like would be in the chariot with those guys, even though they're doing charioteer type work. If things go wrong or you get in hand-to-hand combat, you're going to need something like that, except this weapon that we're looking at is ceremonial. And they've always said that about this piece and quite a few others that they found, because if you look during the little crescent that here at the bottom of it, it should be worked down to a fine point and a sharpened edge all across here, and it would go down about another inch or so all the way across it if it did, but it doesn't. If you look at the hasp or the neck where it attaches to the piece of wood there, we see a lion onto it, but then it's held on to by this side, and that side has an effigy of this Ares type depiction, which is wearing a necklace that looks kind of Egyptian, but that's the collar that actually connects that half moon crescent. Yeah, it looks like a war axe that everybody's familiar with, but let's be correct here. It's a crescent form of it. In fact, if you look closer, just on either side of that color that has the Aries and the neckwear, there are pinches put into it that a lot of people have said mimics work of an old sickle or scythes, to where that leading edge would never have been sharpened. That's where you're holding on to it, and the inside would have been chipped obsidian or flint in an old style, gardening and farming and collecting that way, right? And this is the sickle and the sickle moon or scythe. So you wonder what connections they have with Scythians or Scythians, if you will. And there's a hell of a lot. Also, quite often, right there on the right side where it does a connective, there's usually a band that'll go around that. Quite often, this piece of wood that's shoved up in there is shaved, right where it goes into the collar, just a little bit. But then the rest of it is a little bit thicker, and so the collar that's there around that band that I just talked about would be a little bit thicker. They're bigger around, dilated out than the others, and they would heat it up real good and try to shove it onto there while it was wet so it doesn't destroy the wood to where it becomes all wonky, and you'd shove it through the top of it. Then a lot of times there's wood sticking out of this point that's right here, and in doing so they take a pin and put it in the top of that, which flares out that wood, and it keeps it real tight, and there's no longer any give to it at all, and you can hit things with it. Of course, this one is ceremonial pretty much, and with a burial and type of thing, where to the afterlife he takes something that's more godly. If you look at the iconography that's on this, other than what we've talked about already with a Leo and a lion type face where he's in a roar at the top, you'll see that there's a griffin type lion that's right down at the bottom of it, right below the Hathor type of image, if you will, or the Aries type of image, if you will. And then on the crescent out to the right is something that looks reminiscent of a donkey braying or a cow braying in a full moo. And then on the right side, corresponding to it over there, or on the left, corresponding to it on the other side, is one that looks like a lion or so, but it almost looks like it has a human face to it. I think that's just the way it's dented in there, but so here we have an animistic form a little bit too. But these people brought a lot with it, and you say, well, do they bring these war axes and things that most people would connect to Vikings and Celts? Just like Phoenician ships and things and all those cultures. It's not just that thing, it's a lot of the stuff that the iconography means, the step in religion that goes along with it, that is astrotheology and all the things that we talked about before. It's a step forward because that right there is hardened copper into bronze, but these people also are the ones that brought steel to the populace of the world. They also had those chariots that are a little more advanced than the other people, and the real advancement of the chariot wasn't necessarily the tires or something, but it was the horsepower. We still go under that today, horsepower and where that comes from. That bow and arrow that he's got in his hand too, doesn't look like it in this picture, but they had composite bows which pulled and had a larger draw. They shot much harder, much farther, and now you didn't have to be within 15 yards of somebody trying to shoot at each other and then go hand to hand, but there was now a real archery unit that, using their bows, could actually shoot the other people when they were out of range to be able to shoot at you. Yeah, they could do slings and spears and try to launch them, and that was the best they could pretty much do against it, and so it really outclassed them. Well, let's get into this more. The rise of the IE-speaking Hittites in central Anatolia happened a few centuries after the disappearance of the Makop and Yamna cultures. And what's strange is that has a coincidence of time, considering that most Indo-European forms of R1b found in Anatolia today belong to the R1b Z2103 subclad. It makes little doubt that the Hittites came to Anatolia via the Balkans after Yamna Makop people invaded Southeast Europe. The Makop and Yamna cultures were succeeded by the Srubna culture in 1600 to 1200 BC era, possibly representing an advance in R1a people from the northern steppes towards the Black Sea shores, filling the vacuum left by the R1b tribes who migrated into southeast Europe and into Anatolia once again. And so we're looking here at two depictions of earliest of writings and symbology that they have attached to them. On the left, you're going to see something you recognize as a cuneiform writing. Notice that cuneiform in the Sumerians is a different linguistics attachment than this Proto-Indo-European form that's here. In fact, there's an Afro-Asiatic or a Hamite type that the Egyptians have in there too, and it's subtly different. But this is the same culture. In fact, they had the lingua franca with this type going all the way back, where first of writings and the connection on the whole Fertile Crescent. This also lends an ideal to biblical ideas, where here we have this Japhethite, we have that Shemitic type that come out of Sumeria, where the biblical stories come out of, and their linguistics that go on that, and then Hamite types. On your right, it might look like it's a football jersey number of 22 and 55, hut, but that's not 22 and 55. Those are swastikas. One rolling forward through time, one rolling back. We talked about that enough in a lot of other videos, but it's a symbology that goes with this, and it has a lot of symbology that carries on, and these people have symbology that goes through the entire cultures. Coming up on your bottom left there is an early Sphinx type of symbology, where the lion is winged and it's got the human head type thing, and then it has what looks like the crown of Upper Egypt on it also conspicuously, doesn't it? Has a couple of horns right outside of it too, and now we see that Sumerian horned type mythology. And now we're not too far away from Fred Flintstone and his grand poobahs having what looked like when I was a kid as a purple fez type helmet with horns coming out of it like a Viking. But this one is that bowling pin hat. And quite later, not too long later, shows a Phrygian type cap that's all connected with these people too. And Phrygia, we'll mention that as we go down through it. These Hittite people from at least 2000 to 1178 BC were the first Indo-Europeans to defy and defeat the mighty Mesopotamian and Egyptian empires. There are two hypotheses regarding the origin of the Hittites. The first is that they came from the Eastern Balkans and invaded Anatolia by crossing the Bosphorus. That would mean that they belonged to either the L23 or Z2103 subclad. But the other plausible scenario is that they had an offshoot of the late Makop culture and that they crossed the Caucasus area to conquer the Hittian Empire and kingdom, perhaps after being displaced from the northern Caucasus by the R1a people of the catacomb culture. In that case, the Hittites might have belonged to R1b M269 or R1b M73 subclad. The first hypothesis has the advantage of having a single nucleus, the Balkans, as the post-Yamna expansion of all Indo-European 1b. The Makop hypothesis, on the other hand, would explain why the Anatolian branch of IE languages, i.e. Hittite, Luwian, Lydian, Palaic, is so archaic compared to other Indo-European languages which would have originated in Yamna rather than Makop. And it's possible that we really have two things going on from the same culture, isn't it? There is substantial archaeological and linguistic evidence that Troy was an Indo-European city, associated with the steppe culture and haplogroup R1b again. The Trojans were Luwian speakers related to the Hittites, hence Indo-European, which attested cultural ties to the culture of the Pontic Caspian steppe. The first city of Troy dates back to 3000 BC, right in the middle of the Makop period. Troy might have been founded by Maykop people as a colony, securing the trade routes between the Black Sea and the Aegean. The founding of Troy happens to coincide exactly with the time of the first galleys were made. Considering the early foundation of Troy, the most likely of the two Indo-European paternal haplogroups would be R1b M269R and L23. Now, these people bringing down into this land, and it says Tarhantasa, named after that famous one there, and then there, so is loose city-states. Well, if you think about it, so were the nomes of Egypt, but together as one. So was Samaria eventually brought in the same situation, but it pretty much choked off the original culture that was there, for it was taken over by Assyrians. But we can see the earliest recorded Proto-Indo-European linguistics. Chariot warfare in the Near East is the old Hittite Anita text of 18th century BC, and the Battle of Kadesh against the Egyptians in 1299. It's likely to have been the largest chariot battle ever fought, ever, including some 5,000 chariots. That's one that actually they lost. Yeah, then we have the Hittite culture that comes down, and everybody acts like, oh, they just popped up like popcorn. Well, now we looked at the people that were running the Hittites, and they go, no, they were there. They were there. It wasn't just pop up like popcorn. Then we still have the idea, well, how come the horse thing and all of that just comes in all at once? That's because those people that were running the lower part of Egypt, as it shows in this diagram right here, were actually these people. But they were before. So whenever they took the people that they could diagnose and tell, you know, that's all the Hittites, and they were positive, they kicked them out. It's the reason that they still have R1b. In fact, we can talk all day about blonde-haired mummies going way back, blue-eyed Egyptians going way back. The earliest dynasty depictions you have, just look up blue-eyed Egyptians and it'll show you all these statues that have crystal blue eyes. That's still a misnomer. They don't know how they made them so perfect back in an early time. But of course, if you look at some of their early pottery in those earliest of dynasties, they really had it going on. And those dynasties came to ruin, we figured out now after much studies, off of a volcano that happened down in Africa that cast across, ruining the last and turning into Sahara of those oases, and left only a few of them left viable, but also caused a huge drought that caused the end of the first dynasty and left into the first intermediate period, as we call it, and they never came back to their great pyramid culture. Well, even if they did, which they kind of did later in the 18th century and so on, they weren't going to waste it on building a gigantic pyramid anymore. That was already done. I've said it in a few videos before, but you know, why did they build the pyramids? Why did they do this? Why did they do that? Pardon me. Well, it seems that there were a people that were great enough to try to build monuments for long in the future. People would still be able to recognize that these were a once great people, and they wanted to prop it up there. And it wasn't just the king, it's the entire people that were able to pull together and do something like this. It's the last left remnant of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and they're still there today. They're excavating down here in the Delta too, and getting a little bit more information of pre-Hyksos times again, and actually pre-dynastic, and getting quite a confusing array of objects out of it too. We'll get into that as soon as they release one of the things on it. 1200 BC is a turning point in European and Near Eastern history. In Central Europe, it was the urnified culture, Urnfield culture, that evolved into the Hallstatt culture in German, traditionally associated with a classical Celtic civilization, which was to have a crucial influence on the development of ancient Rome. In Italy, the Terramore culture comes to an end with the Italo-Catalan invasions. There's also the Etruscans that wink out in their power, and it comes into Rome too, but let's not get into that declamation here in this. But in the Pontic steppes, the Thrubna culture let place to the Cimmerians. Cue that music again. A nomadic people speaking an Iranian or Thracian type language. The Iron Age Colchian culture, 1200 to 600 BC, starts in the North Caucasus region. Its further expansions to the south in the Caucasus correspond to the first historical mentions of the Proto-Armenian branch of Indo-European languages, circa 1200 BC. Now we're talking about the Colchians there, and that's, of course, the people of the Golden Fleece and so on. But we've also recently talked about how Herodotus said that the Colchians are the same people as the Egyptians. And now we're looking at the haplotypes that we had going on and what they've gone on with King Tut and their whole lineages here. Perhaps we make an easy connection to who they were and how they were kind of the same people. Of course, he said it wasn't outward gestures and the way they looked. It was actually their forms of making linen, rituals, and the fact that they were both circumcised and so on. Other than that, they weren't much different than any other people in the area in an outward appearance, and that, of course, shows you that connection also. In the central Levant, the Phoenicians started establishing themselves as significant maritime powers as early as about 3000 BC, by the way, and building their commercial empire around the southern Mediterranean. But the most important event of the period was incontestably destruction of the Near Eastern civilizations, possibly by the Sea Peoples, as everybody calls them, and the great catastrophe that ravaged the whole Eastern Mediterranean from Greece to Egypt, circa 1200 BC, is a subject that remains controversial. The identity of the Sea Peoples has been the subject of numerous speculations, and what is certain is that all the palace-based societies in the Near East were abruptly brought to an end by tremendous acts of destruction, pillage, and razing the cities. It's almost that Atlantean tale where there were people that came out from the Pillars of Hercules and came all through and they did all these things and stuff. It's only now, and this time, they're 10,000 years removed of that, and they're, well, not quite that, and they're coming from up over here and utilizing the sea quite well. The most common explanation is that the region was invaded by technologically advanced warriors from the north, probably Indo-Europeans descended from the steppes via the Balkans. The Hittite capital, Hattusha, which I just did the video about, was destroyed in about 1200 BC, and by 1160 BC the empire had collapsed, probably under the pressure of the Phrygians and the Armenians coming from the Balkans. And we talk about ancient Troy and how it goes on, and there's something about this big old horse and all these people and something, and then that got a da-da-da. Now we can probably make a little more sense to these people and this horse and how that took over. Yeah, I've talked about, too, how mythologies get twisted around upon themselves, and then they look back and act like we took that out, when in reality, at least half of that that's going on was those themselves. The Mycenaean cities were ravaged and abandoned through the 12th century BC, leading to the eventual collapse of Mycenaean culture by the 1100 BC, and the kingdom of Ugarit in Syria was annihilated, and its capital never resettled. And luckily, whenever it did, there's a lot of tablets that were in there too, and when we studied that, here we found those biblical type people and the Yam that they talked of, like the Yamnia culture, which would have been attached to a river god in the whole situation, and then that they had killed Yam. And we've made connections how that, well, that's supposed to be like he killed Leviathan, like this, like that. Well, if you look at all these people that are connected with it, everybody's got that same thing they plug into their mythology in that same way, don't they? It's amazing how easy you can make that connection if you'll just allow yourself to. Yeah, better than that, though, that culture is known to have spawned out what we later call some of the tribes of Egypt, and a lot of people say, no, that's that major one that you're talking about right there. We talk about the dispersal in the 12 tribes, 10 that end up making up this thing, And we're looking at all of them right now. And these people that came in brought civilization to the world, or at least to Middle Earth. The Mycenaean cities were ravaged and abandoned through the 12th century BC, leading to eventual collapse of the Mycenaean civilization by 1100 BC. Kingdom of Ugarit in Syria had annihilated, and the capital never resettled. Other cities in Levant, Cyprus, and Crete were burned and left abandoned for many generations. They had a volcano there that caused great havoc across the whole area too, so it sure as hell didn't help in this endeavor. In fact, made it to where it was hard to come back from. The Egyptians had to repel assaults from the Philistines from the east and the Libyans from the west, two tribes of supposed Indo-European origins, by the way, ancient Indo-European origins. The Libyans were accompanied by mercenaries from northern lands, the Ekwesh, Teresh, Lucca, Sheridan, and Shekelesh, whose origin is uncertain but has been placed in Anatolia, Greece, and our southern Italy. Yeah, and Sardinia and all this, so that's them. So it came from all over the place. And the people that were getting devastated, they needed a place to go. But there's also another showing there where there are people coming in through the area. They end up helping to resettle it out later, but the devastation of Greece followed the legendary Trojan War of 1194 to 1187 BC. It has been postulated that the Dorian civilization and Indo-European people from the Balkans, probably coming from modern Bulgaria and Macedonia, invaded a weakened Mycenaean Greece after the Trojan War and finally settled in Greece as one of the three major ethnic groups. The Dorian regions of classical Greece, where Doric dialects were spoken, were essentially the southern and eastern Peloponnese, Crete, and Rhodes, which is also part of Greece with the highest percentage of R1b and L23. And of course, this led to Alexander the Great and everything, and he had at least one blue eye, and a strange effect like David Bowie did, where one was brown and one was blue, and they said he was half divine from that situation, or it was a marker of such. Another hypothesis is that the migration of the Illyrians from northeast Europe to the Balkans displaced previous Indo-European tribes, namely the Dorians to Greece and the Phrygians to northwestern Anatolia, and the Libu to Libya after a failed attempt to conquer the Nile Delta in Egypt. The Philistines, perhaps displaced from Anatolia, finally settled in the Palestine around 1200 BC, unable to actually enter Egypt. And that led to the Libyan culture that they talk about and show so much, that had these tattoos and stuff hooked up with them in the earliest depictions. And they're like, what? Yeah. Here we have a cool little artifact from there, and it's got griffins and dragons all over it, and jadish type color, and you'd say, oh man, that looks almost oriental. Yeah, well, there's a reason for that. But also, can you see that that's the center of a hex right there? That someone has worked that stone down to that point and then carved intricately into it. Ribbons of ropes and circles around names and such. So that's Griffins on a Dacian artifact way back then. The Dhaka. So now we know the genetics of these people that came through at this point. And whenever you look at a picture like this and how they eventually took over Egypt here, and of course the Hittites that came in, no, when we look at that, after the Hittites got expelled back out, that was what was going on. We can look way back at the 12th dynasty and see U6 and Jehudi Nakht and so on. In fact, a pre-dynastic blonde-haired Ghibelline mummy is pretty much a dead giveaway. No, their hair doesn't change color or any type or anything like that, of course, from the pre-dynastic all the way through. Got another video coming up on talking about pre-dynastic and how that Egypt fell, but that's for another video. Thought this was interesting, and it made a good connection to a lot of the subjects that we've been talking about recently, and people, and Conan the Barbarian, and scythes, and Scythian type people, in connection to Kurgan burials and things like that. And while in here they say that, oh, it just sweeps over and goes over to Europe and everything, I think we realize that with that blue-eyed contingent at 69 to 6500 BC, or years ago, comes into the Anatolian area, that also does something to that area. It already had it going on with the cultures that we talked about before, but this brought a whole new level to the layer of the onion, if you will. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy, and we'll get on to the next exciting archaeological find. Peace.